Without further ado, I have been told that Dr. Wagner is on deck here, so I will turn it over to her.
Let me begin by saying just how sorry I am that I am not able to be there and present with all of you. As Vanessa said, many of us tried pretty darn hard today, and it just didn't seem like it was in the cards. I also want to begin by starting with some thanks. First of all, Vanessa, for your invitation to help kick off this inaugural summit. I want to make sure that I'm thanking Jeff Lebow and Chuck Konsutsky, as well as Di Francis. All of these folks put in a lot of extra effort today to try and figure out how it would be possible for me to be able to give this talk. So without further ado, let me get to the talk itself. I entitled it Accounting for Absence, the Science and Sociality of MIA Recovery Efforts in Southeast Asia. And I did so with an eye towards creating some space in which we could talk about not only the US experience and enterprise of MIA accounting, but also the other side of the coin. If we think of the conflict in Southeast Asia, that of the Vietnamese state and of members of the Vietnamese community, both within Vietnam and abroad, who are seeking to acknowledge the loss of a more marginalized population within the broader scheme of the war dead from that conflict. So get us started, I thought it would be useful if I explained a little bit about how I approach the study of MIA accounting. I am a social anthropologist, which means as much as I study forensic anthropology or forensic genetics, I really don't have a scientific bone in my body. And so my approach tends to be much more about the socio-political processes, significance, import of forensic scientific tools as they're brought to bear, specifically in post-conflict societies. I cut my teeth, ethnographically speaking, in the eastern part of Bosnia and Herzegovina. In 2003, I went there as a budding doctoral researcher. I was doing my dissertation research on the identification of the missing from the Srebrenica genocide. I had the opportunity to work both with the families, the surviving kin of the genocide victims, as well as the International Commission on Missing Persons, some of their forensic staff who lived in the city of Tuzla. That experience opened up what I understood to be both science and its application, especially as an intervention in a post-conflict society. It helped me understand the notion of missing as something that wasn't just about physical remains. It wasn't just about bodies that needed to be returned. It was also, in the eyes of family members, very much about, the absence of knowledge, what they didn't know about the final moments of life and death of their loved one. And in the case of Srebrenica, because of the atrocities that were committed in that month of July 1995, they didn't know much and they feared much about the way in which those remains, the remains of their loved ones were disposed of. So missing became a much more complicated concept because I understood it to be not just about remains, but also about knowledge. And then secondly, the work in Bosnia and Herzegovina really opened up the notion of identification so that it wasn't just about what was happening in a laboratory, but rather it was also about what I call forms of recognition. And I see that as processes of recognition that radiate out from the individual. If we think about identification, of course, it's recognizing a set of remains, reattaching a name. But it was also Bosnia and Herzegovina in the Srebrenica cases made it patently clear that families very much needed to be a part of that process of recognition. Indeed, they had actually driven the establishment of a comprehensive DNA-led basis for identifying and returning their loved ones. The other thing about identification and recognition in Bosnia and Herzegovina is I understood it not just to be about the process that led to remains being identified and returned, but that recognition flowed from that process, right? It flowed from the scientific endeavors. And what I mean by that is, as you can see depicted in this photograph, the results of the ICMP-led identification initiative allowed for Srebrenica family members to have their loved ones' remains returned, and then they were given the choice where to bury them. And so overwhelming majority broke with some of the pre-war traditions and decided to bury their loved ones in a collective cemetery. So that identification effort led to a direct attestation, a direct sort of manifestation of the violence, its intensity and its scale to the wider world, right? To the Bosnian Serb perpetrators, some of whom were insisting it never happened, and as well to the international community, sort of showing to them, holding it up to their face that this is what happened because they failed to protect the refugees who had sought safe haven within the Srebrenica enclave. So that was the backdrop, and that's really where I started to forge my career. I've spent 2 decades looking at forensic science applied in the context of missing persons populations and in the wake of war. When I started to wrap up my research in Bosnia and Herzegovina, I was actually following what I would call an ethnographic thread. There was a connection between Bosnia and Herzegovina and the United States around forensic expertise, specifically genetic expertise. And the International Commission on Missing Persons is the link there. I can talk about it more in the Q&A if you're at all curious. But I was tracing this link back, and it got me thinking about, well, what is it that our country does with its missing person populations? Now, 9/11 had happened, and so that was front and center in my mind. But I was also very much aware that there was this enormous enterprise housed within the Department of Defense that sought to find the remains of the missing in action, the killed in action body not recovered from the major conflicts of the previous century. Now, I ended up focusing, as I traced this arc between or across recovery, identification, and commemoration, ended up focusing in on Vietnam. And Benicia is not wrong. In many ways, I think of the anchor to my research across that arc, and in my ability to write up my findings in the book What Remains, that anchor was Wisconsin. And for that reason alone, it was such a delight to be able to come. I wish I could physically be in Wisconsin, because for me, it is, as I say, almost like the epicenter of my ideas. I had the very good fortune early on in that research project, which spanned from 2009 to 2019. In 2012, I accompanied one of JPAC's, that's a Joint POW-MIA Accounting Command. The Central Identification Laboratory had sent out a series of recovery teams to Vietnam, and I was able to join one of them. It was a team of 13 people, and we were investigating a crash site where 5 individuals were missing. We did, in fact, recover remains over the course of that month-long excavation, and one tooth was definitively associated with Lance Corporal Merlin Ray Allen. And it turned out that he was from Bayfield, Wisconsin. And so this project ended up being, as I say, in some parts, particularly around the commemoration, centered in Wisconsin. I went up to Bayfield. I got to know members of the VFW post 8293. It was 8239 in Red Cliff. I got to know some of the Allen family, as well as another missing in action or killed in action body not recovered, for whom that VFW post is named, Dwayne Wotsi-Soulier. And so this, in a nutshell, is the broader project that I've been a part of in studying the U.S. military's accounting efforts. For the purposes of this talk, I also wanted to bring in something that I've been working on more recently over the last 3 years. It's in conjunction with a project led by Dr. Tom Nyo. Tom Nyo is the senior researcher and project leader of Bones of Contention, Technologies of Identification and Politics of Reconciliation in Vietnam. Now, this is a project that is looking at the Vietnamese, principally the Vietnamese efforts and experiences of MIA accounting. It is housed at the NIOD, which is the Institute for the Holocaust, War, and Genocide Studies in Amsterdam. I wanted to provide you, if you're at all interested, just to get to know some of the research that they're doing, a fantastic article by Tom Nyo that she published in 2021. It's really one of the first outputs of this larger project. I've created the QR codes. You can snap that and take your time. It's a brilliant article. I went back to it in preparing for this talk, and I just thought, this is something I need to teach more often, but it was just a reminder of the rich ethnographic material that she has unearthed and analyzed. And the other resource that might help you understand a bit better this larger project of Bones of Contention It is a podcast that Dotwin, who is the postdoctoral researcher, Tom No, and I did this past summer. We came together, the pandemic restrictions were somewhat lifted, and so we were finally able to be in the same space physically. And so we recorded a podcast in which we sort of compared, we talked through some of the parallels, the similarities and the divergences between the US and the US sort of nation state to nation state, the US and the Vietnamese MIA accounting efforts. So bones of contention is in the back of my mind as I thought about what I'd like to talk about today. I really wanted to set up for us a kind of comparison and contrast between the United States efforts, and I assume many of you have a little bit of a background in that, understanding, you know, the scope of it, the object of it, some of the technological processes. I wanted to juxtapose that with Vietnam's story, as well as a third case, and as I mentioned, the South Vietnamese, both within Vietnam itself, but also overseas South Vietnamese diaspora, including here in the United States. So the idea is to compare the processes of searching, recovery, identification, and commemoration. But it's also to think about the politics, right? The politics that undergird these efforts and this attempt to animate the dead and have them sort of conscripted into the world of the living. So it may be helpful for me to explain what I mean by necropolitics just a little bit. It comes from the Cameroonian historian Achille Mbembe, who wrote in a 2003 article and subsequently has published a book about this kind of power that can be forged. He calls it the ultimate expression of sovereignty that determines who can live and who can die. And for those of you who know a little critical theory, it should sound a little bit like Michel Foucault. He's expanding it and focusing our attention on the dead, among others, on those who are dying and those who are, and the bodies of the dead. And he wants to show how the dead do work, right? How they're part of producing, you know, a sovereignty and managing both the living and the dead. For our purposes, it might be useful to consider some sort of shorthand questions. You know, if you think of Tom LaCour, you know, the work of the dead, well, what kind of work are war dead doing in particular? Or a corollary, which dead count? Among the war dead, who are considered the heroic fallen? And who are considered the enemy dead? And who gets to make the decision in distinguishing between the two? In that, you know, that should point us towards, if we're talking about sovereignty, we're typically talking here about the state. So in the state, as it's parsing out, you know, who counts and who doesn't, how do they go about managing these dead, managing their physical remains, but also managing commemoration, how they are remembered. In the case of Vietnam, it stretches us even further to think about how they seek to manage the spirit and the cases in which that management falls short. It cannot capture the sort of this rich world between the living and the dead that the spirits, the wandering ghosts of the MIAs within across the landscape in Vietnam may entail. So that's the sort of conceptual framing that's been really useful, really fruitful with the Bones of a Contention project. And I want to see if I can tease it out a little bit by juxtaposing these three examples. Let's see. There we go. All right, so first let's start with the United States. Some of you may recognize the missing in action from the Vietnam War, the Defense POW MIA Accounting Agency, the headquarters of which in Hawaii, in Oahu, you can see here. They tabulate that to date, right now, as of now, 1,581 individual service members are still considered missing in action, or we'll say killed in action, body not recovered from that conflict. And that's from that total of 58,220 individuals. That number, 1,581, in many ways, goes against the grain of an American sensibility or a tradition of caring for war dead. Some of you will recognize the scene unfolding here. This is at the Tomb of the Unknowns in Arlington National Cemetery. It's the changing of the guard ceremony that happens either on the half hour or the hour, depending on the season. I see that as, along the lines of Benedict Anderson, that it is this space that does extraordinarily important work for the nation in establishing, our imagined connectedness, right? The imagined community of the nation. So someone has died for this thing that I therefore belong to, right? It gets us to think about who is that person and what is this nation to me? How do I belong to it? But in some ways, the Tomb of the Unknowns is a repudiation, or at least the unfulfillment of these two central tenets of how the United States cares for its war dead. The first one is repatriation, like this insistence that American service members who fight and die for the country, their remains need to come home. And the historian Drew Gilpin-Faust, this is an idea, this is a practice that she documents, stretches all the way back to the Civil War. Across the 20th century, we see an additional tenet being honed, being continually refined, and that is individuated identification. So it's not just that we have this unease at fallen soldiers somewhere on distant soil and that they need to come back, but it's also that those remains need to be identified individually. So therefore they can be recognized individually for their sacrifice to the state, right? That this twin tenets of repatriation and individuated identification, to my mind, as I was trying to research and eventually argue in What Remains, they come to the fore. And in some ways, I would argue that they are like crystallized in a particular moment in the late 1990s. That moment is when that iconic space of the Tomb of the Unknowns. Now, you saw the image. There's the tomb itself that's raised above the plaza. That's the monument. That's the sarcophagus to World War I. But there are 3 other crypts. So there was a crypt to the Second World War, the Korean War, which still have remains. And then there was the Vietnam War unknown soldier. So in 1998. The Defense Department, in large part, its hand was forced that it had to open up the crypt, like literally jackhammer into into its depths and remove remains, because there was a strong suspicion they might know, the family might know, investigative journalists might know who actually was the unknown soldier. And indeed, not just because of forensic anthropological examination, but because of this new, strong, potent line of evidence, DNA extraction analysis, it was shown that, in fact, the unknown soldier was First Lieutenant Michael Joseph Blassie. There is this, I always come back to this quotation because to me it's so powerful, and yet I understand Secretary of Defense Moon Cohn, he sort of uttered it in a slightly off the cuff remark, but he was trying to explain, like, this is a momentous occasion, right? Like, they didn't really want to go into why they ended up putting an unknown in the crypt that then may be identified later. But it was sort of, I don't want to say spin, but turning it to say, aha, we have this moment of potential scientific triumph. It may be that forensic science has reached the point where there will be no other unknowns in any war. And I take that articulation as almost like a distillation of a growing sensibility, one cultivated by the Department of Defense, that asserts the United States is singular, right? It spares no resources. Well, Congress makes sure that it spares some resources, but that it has a kind of ethos around its care of the dead, right? An ethos of exceptional care. And one of the challenges with raising the stakes to that level is that it also raises expectations. And in the context of the US military's mission to account for its missing in action, its missing war dead, the number of accessions, the number of bones that are coming into the laboratory from Southeast Asia at this point are so small. There's such a fraction in comparison to the conflicts of World War II and the Korean War, as unknowns are being disinterred, as major, air crash sites are being excavated and remains are returning to the lab. And so there is a little bit of a disjuncture for the Southeast Asia conflict, because despite the fact that expectations are so high, that we have all of these tools at our disposal, that the remains themselves, as 1,581, it is much harder to get those remains and to definitively identify them. So one of the things that I wanted to demonstrate in holding up the US case is both the discourse, right? The discourse of exceptionalist care and the ramifications when expectations are raised and, it cannot be fulfilled by concrete action. Now, there's a similar dynamic going on with Vietnam. And here, the next two cases I'm going to be drawing from my colleagues' work, their ethnographic research, their archival research within the Bones of Contention project. So the first of these two is Vietnam, the state itself. So note that they talk about missing in action, not from the Vietnam War, but from, this is what the war is called in Vietnamese, the resistance war against America. Their numbers dwarf ours. And I think that's a really important point, something to sit with for a moment here. We're talking about not 1,581, we are talking about 300,000 missing, coming from that larger fatality number of 3 million. Yeah? So, and that is not accounting for casualties in Laos and neighboring Laos and Cambodia. My colleague Tham Ngo writes about, it seeks to situate those 3 million and those 300 missing within a larger discourse of the three major regional but large-scale wars that took place in the 20th century and fighting against colonial occupations that eventually led to the establishment of the state of Vietnam, the communist state of Vietnam. That 1.2 million soldiers died, and as the Vietnamese government celebrates this and honors this, sacrificed their lives in order to establish that state. Yeah? Of that 1.2 million, it is over a half who are either buried as unknowns, right? Unknown soldiers within designated national military cemeteries, or they're simply counted as missing, right? Missing in action. So that's the backdrop. That's the enormity of the endeavor for MIA accounting that the Vietnamese state is faced with. So I want to tell you a little bit about Tom's work and a little bit about her investigations into a kind of dual methodology that has emerged within Vietnam that really challenges some of our notions about what necropolitics looks like and what are the tools that are used to advance its agenda. Yeah. So first of all, I'll start with the trajectory of it. I gave you the numbers. Well, part of it is understanding as the Vietnamese state is emerging from a centrally planned economy to a market economy, as historian Huey Tham Ho Thai, she talks about it as it enters into this commemoration fever. And so there are memorials that are established. There's an expansion of the National Military Cemetery Network. There's a lot of ritual, sort of commemorative ritualistic activity happening at the national level in the 1980s and the 1990s. But in a way, and this is what my colleague Tham Ngo argues in her Bones of Contention, American ethnologist piece, is that it's these commemorative spaces and rituals feel somewhat hollow to family members and to members of the community who feel the pressing need to care for remains. And here it's really important to understand remains are not just remains, they are also kind of the conduit for caring for spirits. Yeah. And so there is this dynamic relationship between the living and the dead that is, that yes, is a part of the national schema of MI accounting, but is very much about the kind of the day-to-day keeping of reciprocal ties as the dead, particularly those who died unnatural deaths, violent deaths, what Anthropologist Hyun Kwan explains in the language of the Vietnamese of death on the street, right? So not death at home, not around your loved ones, not in the spaces that are familiar and welcoming, but rather sort of the abject death apart from that social network. That those individuals, if they are not settled through ritualistic care, end up being these spirits that are in sort of this liminal space, wandering ghosts. So if you can imagine that sort of condition of anxiety about the lack of care, or you can imagine someone who doesn't know where his son died, and therefore has no sense of whether someone is doing that propitiatory, that ritualistic work to try and take care of his remains, to take care of his spirit, they then also, are concerned about, well, what spirits are in our world and how are we to appease those spirits? So it's a much more dynamic, and I would say, a much more communal sense of reciprocity between the living and the dead. Now, into that void where the state is not exhuming and identifying remains, enters what Tom Newell calls spiritual forensics, right? So there literally is a rise, almost like a burgeoning industry of spirit mediums who take on the role of finding the graves, right? Of locating remains, of assisting the families with that ritual process of propitiating the spirits, of ritual activity, of exhuming remains, of reburying them, so on and so forth. So that's one realm. And gradually the Vietnamese state, as she explains, has to make room, right? Has to acknowledge that its citizens are reaching out for and embracing this spiritual forensics. Now, at the same time, they're also part of a much, a larger international dialogue where there are these pressures, and there's examples. They are working for decades. They've been working with the US in its search for its missing and its prioritizing of DNA extraction analysis. And so you have these twin these efforts, right? Spiritual forensics and forensic genetics. And in 2013, the Vietnamese state announces that it's establishing this project, this vast project at MIA recovery through the tool of DNA. It's called Project 150. Some of you may recall there was this rather provocative article that was published in 2016 in Nature magazine that sort of touted both the establishment or the attempts to establish this program and what it would amount to. So the world's largest systematic identification project will use smart DNA testing technology. The challenge there, and then one of the scientists who's quoted in that article went on to say, look, in a few years, we're going to be able to identify 8,000 to 10,000 individuals per year. So talk about raised expectations. And in the aftermath of Project 150, where the results didn't flow, they just didn't come, certainly not in the 8,000 to 10,000 range, there were a lot of obstacles. There's sort of logistical obstacles. There were literally the material obstacles of remains having been buried for 5-6 decades in this highly acidic soil, the degradation of the DNA itself. So this was a source of national and to a certain extent international embarrassment, right? That this project had never really taken off. Let's see. That's not to say that it's been entirely given up. And the last point that I want to make about this case study is that with the Vietnamese government, they continue to pursue this DNA or this sort of forensic genetics centered effort to account for its missing in action. It's missing, and it's doing so. It's previously worked with the International Commission on Missing Persons and other NGOs, including the Argentine Forensic Anthropology Group team. So, but more recently, and as recent as literally last week, the International Commission on Missing Persons invited a delegation of Vietnamese officials and scientists who brought with them 100, as I understand it, 100 bone samples, which the laboratory which is now based in The Hague. ICMP, it forged its reputation in the Srebrenica cases in Bosnia and Herzegovina, and eventually it moved headquarters from Sarajevo to The Hague. And so this became the meeting place whereby the International Commission on Missing Persons sort of laid out an implementation plan through which it would help the Vietnamese state build the resources and accomplish and really sort of crack this nut of this vast missing persons population, which has extraordinarily challenging DNA extraction issues. Interestingly, and that's why I have the language of international intermediaries, it is a meeting of these two nation state projects because it's the United States government that is funding in large part ICMP's efforts. The funding is coming from the USAID. Now, it's not a foregone conclusion that money will remain. It's driven in large part by Senator Patrick Leahy, and it's not entirely sure if this is an initiative that is going to have several years in front of it. But nevertheless, I found it kind of intriguing that ICMP is working as a kind of intermediary for the Vietnamese state. My colleague, Tom, she wrote in her earlier article, she pointed out a problem, an issue that existed and will continue to exist. And that is the Vietnamese state's governing of the dead ends up sacralizing fallen Vietnamese soldiers, criminalizing enemy dead, and marginalizing the dead outside these two categories. So in this large initiative of trying to identify tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of its missing, in some form or fashion, it's going to have to address who counts as worthy of those resources and of that forensic attention. And that brings me, I promise, to my final case study. This is the South Vietnamese, right? So these are the missing in action from the Republic of Vietnam. So we're talking about soldiers who fought on behalf of the Republic of Vietnam, the state that existed from 1955 to 1975. So if you think about it, when the conflict in Southeast Asia, when the conflict ended, the South Vietnamese government, the communist state was established, the South Vietnamese government collapsed, right? It was the vanquished. And that meant that its missing no longer counted among the kind of pantheon of the fallen soldiers that a state could then, because there was no state, right? There was no state to honor those fallen. In fact, that group, the Army of the Republic of Vietnam, ARVN soldiers, fell into this category of not just the marginalized, but the enemy dead. Yeah. So who then, if the United States is not interested in recovering and identifying former, its former allies, troops, and certainly the Vietnamese government isn't, to whom is this left, this task? And this is research that Dot Nguyen, the postdoctoral researcher, has been doing, along with another colleague that I'll mention in just a moment. I have depicted here, I want you to see this photograph. This is, it once was one of the central national and military cemeteries for the Republic of Vietnam. It was established in 1967. It was expected to house upwards of 30,000 ARVN soldiers. They estimate somewhere between 16,000 and 18,000 are buried there. Significant numbers unrecognized, either unrecognized, that is unknown, or simply without the care. So this is a scene, and this is something that Dot Nguyen is trying to depict, is that it becomes a space of neglect. And he writes really evocatively that caring for the orphaned or the stateless dead, as I say, falls to those either the local South Vietnamese or diaspora, so people who left the country and still reach back in both their memory and sending funds to try and somehow do the ritual, to perform the rites, to ensure that these individuals, their physical remains, the burial space, the spirits are tended to. And so here Dot writes, while the trees themselves inflicted physical damages on the graves, they were perceived to be part of a long-term deliberate plan to erase the memories of South Vietnam. What I think he's doing here is showing us that necropolitics can happen in these very overt ways of lifting up or shunning, lifting up the sacred fallen soldier or shunning the enemy dead. And then there can be these other sort of more passive ways. Here, literally the government has allowed nature to take over, right? So it is a way in which, without directly, destroying grave sites or removing grave sites, they've let, abandonment sort of do the work of erasure. I'll give you one more example of, the ramifications of this slow sort of ecological erasure. In the eyes of Vietnamese, South Vietnamese, who ended up leaving the country, but yet have very strong ties to their homeland, they've attempted to find channels of activism. And so one example that my colleague Alex Taivo writes about is the Vietnamese American Foundation. So it was an NGO that was established by a man named Nguyen Doc Thanh. He himself had fought with the South Vietnamese. He ended up in a re-education camp, barely survived it. And he writes that if he made a vow that if he ever made it out, he would do everything possible to care for, right, to bring home the remains of his friends and the fellow inmates back to their families. And so that he ends up taking that's literally carrying that sensibility with him as he resettles in the United States. He sets up this foundation, and you can hear almost the language of the US, to fulfill our nation's promise, or until the last man comes home. His motto for his organization is, I will search for you for the remaining days of my life. Yeah. Now, his project started out with these two prongs. The first one was literally trying to locate, recover, attempt sort of ritual reburials in proper cemeteries, or through cremation to care for remains that have been identified. He sought to establish a DNA, partners with the International Organization, the International Organization Migration, that's it, and then the University of North Texas to assist with some of the forensic genetic work. And it just really never panned out. In large part, I mean, there was some success in finding and relocating graves, but an idea of, we have tens of thousands of ARVN soldiers who are unknown, that, an NGO in another country, in fact, the country of the former combatant state, would have any access to the means, the channels, the infrastructure to be able to identify. In the end, this was it's simply not feasible. And so he turns his attention likewise to this cemetery that was depicted in the previous slide, which is as I say, it's the Bin Hoa Cemetery. They undertake efforts to restore, right, to clean up. If they're not allowed to do the DNA testing and they're not allowed to recover and return remains, well, in the very least, they can make this space a sacred space according to its aesthetics and practice. So I just want to wrap up, and in putting together these three examples, trying to expand our scope of analysis beyond the US practice and the US traditions, it got me thinking about something I wrote in What Remains. And I'll quote it here and tell you where I sort of see the shortcomings now that I've done this work with bones of contention. I wrote, whatever the final destination, homecomings enabled by forensic scientific innovations entwine the living with the dead in the project of national belonging. But they do so on local terms and according to the particular histories of loss and remembrance. And I still think that's very much true for the US context. But when we put the US context side by side with the Vietnamese, it really stretches my understanding of national belonging. Where do the South Vietnamese, the ARVN soldiers, where do they belong within this memory work? It also, putting these three examples side by side, it helps me think through a narrower understanding of the relationship between the living and the dead, or the living and the state, or the dead and the state. And what, in the very least, Tham Ngo's work, as she's exploring the spirit mediums and how the work of the spirit mediums are brought in by the state to sort of to function in tandem with the forensic genetics, is we see that there's a much more dynamic way of conceiving of the relationship between not just memory, but the spirit worlds of the living and the dead. So the necropolitical through lines, certainly we can say, DNA, 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 it's still very much, privileged and sort of prioritized as a powerful means of establishing identity. But I think we can also understand by setting these examples together that that necropolitics, it runs into obstacles. It is not always the state that is able to control and to care for the living and the dead. So I'll end it there. I really hope, I know I threw a lot at you, but I would love to be able to have a little Q&A now if you have the energy. So I'll stop sharing my screen and we'll go from there.
Hi, my name is Raquel Pleskis. I really enjoyed your talk, Dr. Wagner. I thought it was really inspiring and helping us encourage us to think through. There's very many different through lines that you mentioned. So I come from a background of ancient DNA, so it's a little bit more in the historic period, working with European and African descended individuals, as well as sometimes indigenous remains. And so I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how you use these through lines to respect and to see all these different ways of remembrance in these different cultural communities and these different time periods. How you go about thinking through these different contexts, and how as researchers be better at respecting and integrating these different perspectives into our practices?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it really helps for me to have in the back of my mind what I learned in Bosnia and Herzegovina, working with the families of the missing. I think that the US military, my ethnographic research with the US military was very focused, and naturally so, on the role of the state, right? And on the commemorative practices that in large part were driven by sort of not just the expectations, but also the performance of the scientific prowess and, the achievement of homecoming. I mean, it's extraordinary to think that Lance Corporal Merlin Ray Allen, one tooth, could come home and could produce for, even if it's an ephemeral moment, this group of total strangers and obviously closest kin who wanted to celebrate that and to think through their relationship with the state. But I will say it's when I pull back from the military context, and I think back to some of the contestations and some of the negotiations that were happening in Bosnia and Herzegovina that weren't just state to individual, but rather, a complex community that had sometimes competing ritual expectations about commemoration. I think it helps me to have these, for that same reason, it helps me to have bones of contention. What does it mean to bury, rebury, to ritualize the bones in order to reach out and, reestablish a relationship with spirits, right? Like that. I think when I begin to expand my notion of the dynamism, the reciprocities, how we define obligation, it's, as a sociocultural anthropologist, it's kind of my job to not think in monolithic terms or one size fits all. I also think, and we're learning so much from contestations, struggles, movements of resistance about reclaiming remains and about the necessity to allow descendant communities, whether that descendant community is perfectly mapped biologically, or rather it's about people who do I call as my kin? Who do I name as my kin? Understanding and respecting that voice and the necessity for that voice to be centered within any kind of recovery, identification, commemoration process. I hear echoes of that in some of the NGOs and some of the organizations working in the space of post-conflict forensic human rights work, like the Argentines team, the forensic anthropology team out of Argentina, that they from day one have always said this is about families standing shoulder to shoulder with families, and that families' interests need to be centered. And I think we hear echoes of that. So I guess it's a meandering answer that I'm learning to not get too focused on, often I'm the kind of person that's right in front of me, and then, I think through that, but it's really useful to pull back and to play in the space of comparative work, and to listen to our colleague. Like I'm learning so much from the Bones of Contention project, and that's why I really wanted to celebrate their work and bring it in today. So.
Thank you, Dr. Wagner. That was fascinating and very insightful. My name is Nam Kim. I'm one of the faculty members here in anthropology on campus. I'm also an archaeologist, and I also actually do field work in Vietnam. So it's a pleasure to hear your talk and to meet you virtually. I was very curious and struck by the different case studies and the different communities that you outline, and in particular, the third one. So when we talk about the diaspora and Vietnamese overseas and the relationship to these historic events and to the missing, I was also struck by your ideas about the state's participation. And in the case of the third category, the lack of a state.
Yes.
Right? So many of these communities who are now either in the United States or elsewhere, how they connect to this history and how they participate in some of these sorts of endeavors. So what I'm getting at is I have relatives who served in the conflict, who died in the conflict, who were also in some of these re-education camps. I have some relatives who refuse to see the legitimacy of the current state of Vietnam. And so when we think about cooperation or potential cooperation and looking into the future, what kinds of challenges have you seen or encountered, or what do you anticipate?
Yeah, another fantastic question. And I have to tell you, again, I'm drawing on the work of Alex Thibault, who gave a fantastic talk this summer. We had a conference where not just scholars of missing, efforts to account for missing or war dead in Southeast Asia, but also in Korea. Hyuna Kwon presented on the Korean Peninsula, and Japan. So part of it was to sort of expand or dispense with a very Western-centric notion of accounting. In that talk that Alex Tai gave, he laid bare the fact that they're really, first of all, and I apologize, I wanted to give you this third example, but I know I didn't do it quite justice because I was sort of racing through the details, but he shows that it's much more nuanced and complex because of political, ideological divides among the diaspora, right? Some who, see the work of the Vietnamese American Foundation as, at times appeasing or at times negotiating in terms that, a staunchly anti-communist stance would not enable or would not encourage. And then Alex Tai also talks about some of the generational gaps, right? So what does it mean to have been born in the US and to have a much more ephemeral connection to Vietnam? Where are the sensibilities of sort of obligations of care, reciprocity? Where do they lie with that generation? And so I want to say his paper is full of these of exploring these nuances. It just so happens that I pulled out from it this sort of central figure and arguably the most active within the diaspora on within the space of remains recovery, relocation of the remittances sent to help rehabilitate the Bien Hoa military cemetery. But you're right. Where it will go, I'm not sure. But one thing I'm fascinated by is I think we should pay attention to what's happening with the International Commission on Missing Persons as they seek to act as this intermediary, because I do think if this is US funds, right, if this is USAID that's, seeking to assist, not directly, but to assist, and that the Vietnamese government is sort of saying, we don't want your AFTL and we don't want your direct expertise, we'll work with ICMP. I wonder to what extent that quotation I had by Tham Nho about the ways in which the Vietnamese state is sort of parsing out, the sacralized fallen, the reviled enemy dead, and then the marginalized. To what extent will that implementation project have to somehow just lay it all on the table? Who's accounting for the South Vietnamese? I think that conversation is to come, but I'm not sure. And I think we need to keep our eyes on it is basically what I would recommend for scholars who are interested in this area.
Thank you very much. I'm Greg Jameson. I'm the lead archaeologist for our project. I love your book. Was hoping you could be here so you could sign it maybe next time. It's completely changed how I think about and understand my recovery. So wanted to say that first. I'll keep it very brief right now. I never heard of this concept of spiritual forensics before, which I find completely fascinating. And I have a two-part question. First of all, do you see parallels anywhere else, like dowsing, for example, at home, closer to the United States? And second of all, how can you describe how that's negotiated?
Yeah.
Or
Ooh,
detail
yeah.
contrasted with forensic science?
Yeah, first of all, I remember reading about this with Hyunwook Kwan's book, one I highly recommend, particularly anyone who is thinking about, working on is for those, working on a recovery mission that might be in Southeast Asia. It's called The Ghosts of War. And it was in that, first of all, it sort of opened up my idea to this whole realm of the spirits involved in thinking of the dead beyond the material or beyond memory, right? Which I think is a very Western, which is, this is what I've been researching, but it was fascinating to learn of that realm. So I'm going to find there's just a fantastic paragraph that Tom has where she talks about it. So if you don't mind, I'm going to quote from her paper. I'll try not to do the whole thing, but so she's talking about the spirit mediums, and she says, according to traditional Vietnamese belief, the dead can be contacted through spirit possession and soul calling. These practices, which the state considers superstition and anti-science, were banned, but calls for their legalization followed the early 1990s success of spirit mediums. Okay, so then so what she says is that the Vietnamese state sort of shifts its position and to officialize the state's employment. So they literally bring them in, the employment of religious actors. The Center for Research into Human Capabilities was established in 1996 under the indirect administration of the Ministry of Science, Technology, and Environment. And here's the line that I really want you to listen to soften the contradiction between its official atheist secularism policy and such tolerance of spirit mediums, the state has renamed them, that is the spirit mediums, persons with special abilities and specialists in extrasensory perception. So I just love the fact that in order to render it sort of legible and intelligible and not, too much of a disjuncture, the state then gives them this sort of, nests them within this Ministry of Science, Technology, and Environment, and then almost like scientific, I don't know how to, I'm trying to think of the verb that would, that sort of the discursive move that officially anoints them as scientific experts. So I can't speak to alternate examples other than I recently was involved in a dissertation defense of a scholar from Mexico. And her dissertation was on attempts to search for and recover the missing, what is it, it's upwards of 30,000 missing in Mexico. And the use of what she calls a vernacular forensics, whereby families searching for the missing, learn the techniques, like they learn how they learn how to sniff out, how to like literally sink in an iron rod into the earth to pull it out and smell it to see if there's a cadaver down there. Like these are the kinds of, they weren't ever trained in any of this, but because the state refuses to address the violence that produced it or the remains themselves, they have to adapt. And so they developed what Marina Allen O'Brien calls vernacular forensics. At any rate, it's fascinating stuff. And so I mentioned to Tom that she should look at Marina's work because there are some commonalities there.
Thank you very much. I see we have a great question on the chat too. Thank you, Dr. Wagner, for your comments. My name is Megan Stanton. While speaking about the Vietnamese case study, you mentioned the marginalization of dead who fall outside of specific categories such as soldiers or enemy dead. Could you continue to speak further about whether and how you've observed marginalization in your research into U.S. state efforts in identification?
What an interesting question. I suppose the first instance and the most obvious instance of that I learned about when I was doing early archival research out at JPAC at the Central Identification Laboratory. So this would have been in 2011, 2012, is learning about the contestations of the inclusion of deserters on the Vietnam Veterans Memorial, right? So that, there were people who were adamantly opposed to including names of deserters on that memorial. So there, like in that sense, a kind of hierarchy. How does that else play out? I mean, I suppose there's a sort of hierarchy. I know there's a hierarchy in the kind of ritualistic performance of homecoming, like who, well, this was the case. I'm afraid to say I don't know if it's still the policy, but when remains were escorted from the laboratory on Oahu back to the mainland, that they needed a military escort of the same rank or higher, right? So there's a sense that, who gets to shepherd these homes. Now that I think the regulations around that have changed, and also some of the monetary restrictions have been in place. So that's one thing. I mean, I think there's something larger. You should take a look at Mickey McElia's book, The Politics of Mourning. She does this fantastic job of analyzing Arlington National Cemetery for the ways in which, including the Tomb of the Unknowns and that performance of military sort of perfection and synchronicity, upholds, heteronormative white ideals of who is a fallen soldier worthy of our gaze and worthy of our attention. So again, that's Mickey McElia, The Politics of Mourning. I think she really does a fantastic job in interrogating that. The only other example I can think of, again, it's with the Tomb of the Unknowns, is just fascinating. We should all spend more time thinking about what that monument does for us, and when it gets interrupted. And so that story of how Michael J. Blassie ended up in the tomb, well, there were 3 other sets of remains that potentially could have gone in there. The Reagan administration was like, get some remains. We want an unknown from Vietnam, from the war. And so one set of remains that was a potential unknown candidate, the reason why it was deemed not to be feasible or eligible is because it had come from a set of remains, a large set of remains where there had been some commingling. And so there was a suspicion there might be remains of a Southeast Asian person. And that sort of, it assumes that there's no Native American who would have been worthy of being, whose remains would be worthy of being set into the Tomb of the Unknowns. You can think about the ramifications, who then phenotypically should be in the tomb, that. And that was the deliberations from, the early 1980s. But at any rate, so those are some examples I can think of off the top of my head. But again, I would say Mickey McElia does a fantastic job exploring just that in The Politics of Mourning.
Everybody who's here tonight and brave our horrible weather is obviously very committed to what we do, and especially, MIA recoveries. But a lot of people here, I don't think, have had the opportunity to experience a recovery mission. Even fewer of us in Southeast Asia and Vietnam. So I know you talk about this in your book, but tell us very quickly what the best part about that was for you, and then the worst part.
Yeah, that's such it was a life-changing experience. The worst part, I'll just say straight up that the physical exertion, I had never traveled to Southeast Asia. I'd certainly never experienced heat and humidity in that way. Was that the worst part? It was the most challenging part. There were moments when, here's an example of something that, I don't know if it's the worst part, but it sort of hovered over the mission for me as a social anthropologist, kind of thinking through the politics of it. There was a day, and I write about this, it was day 3, and we hadn't set up our base camp yet, so we were still sort of essentially commuting in, right? So we would drive in about an hour and then hike into the site. And I think it was day 2 or 3, we're hiking into the site. And so clearly within the first, I would say, a quarter of a mile, there had appeared overnight an unexploded ordnance. And so, someone had left it there. And it could have been as benign as, please do something with this. But the larger issue is, that landscape is littered with, the explosives, the unexploded ordnances, the landmines that we left, right? That we bombarded, and the toxic environment that we created. And I think sort of encountering that, not really understanding sort of the politics of that move. It may have been a gesture of like, just take care of this, but also just the tragic nature that, where were they supposed to put it otherwise? And who was supposed to take care of it otherwise? And I think that moment, I think it was, and maybe the sad part is we didn't talk about it that much, right? Like we didn't spend time picking apart. I mean, the EOD was like all over it, but because that was his job, and he was really aware that these were the real dangers that existed. But I don't know that we really unpacked what it meant. Like we didn't really talk about the scars at the same time that we're trying to pluck from that landscape 5 sets of remains when there were 300,000. So, like that is maybe, I don't know if it's the worst part, but like when I think about it almost a decade later, it still troubles me. The best part, okay, can I say 2? One was, here's again, social anthropologist who really likes this kind of stuff. I loved that in the middle of the day, like at lunchtime, a group of us, the Vietnamese and the US workers, it wasn't the whole group, we would just gather, we would set up these little areas, and we would share food, and we would try to talk to one another. Although there was really, at that point, there was only one person who could serve as an interpreter. And so it was a lot of like, hands and feet and expressions, but just an enjoyment of camaraderie and sharing of food. And that, I think that was particularly special for those of us who took part in that. But the crystallized moment of utter, I don't know, exhilaration was when we found the first tooth. And that, it really would, and it rippled. It wasn't just that it was meaningful to the US members of that site excavating, it was also, the Vietnamese. It made sense that we were laboring so hard, and then something happened. And I think we all pondered what that something was in a really profound way. So.
I'm curious regarding the 300,000, how many are South Vietnamese? So, and is there a future objective with the US to possibly help with this situation?
I'm so glad you asked that question. In fact, when I was preparing the slide, I went back to both Tom and to Alex Vo and said, what are the numbers? I knew someone was going to ask me that. I was like, what are the numbers? And that's why it's sort of this, I don't know what I have, the very vague, like tens of thousands, right? We know that just in that central military cemetery of Benoit, that there are 16,000. I don't know how many of those are carried as unknowns. But the larger point, and I think you're touching on it, is the fact that they're not counted, right? It speaks to Dot Nguyen's language of orphaned dead, or Alex Taivo's language of stateless dead, that these are soldiers who don't register in that commemorative, like that calendar, or the schema whereby their loss gives meaning or bolsters a national narrative. And so they're falling between the cracks, and in these sort of interstices between these two national projects. There have been, and I think someone should chase this down, and I never did, but finding out what exactly is the US policy when remains end up in not the central identity, because it's a laboratory, DPA's laboratory, that they determine to be Vietnamese. Now, typically a review takes place on site in Vietnam. It's a joint review, joint forensic review, where you have Vietnamese scientists and American scientists who are saying, like, is this, possible human remains? And then secondly, the sort of correlate, if yes, then is it Vietnamese or is it American? And so, those questions, I can't help but think there have been multiple occasions where South Vietnamese remains are discovered. I have the sense that they may be offered back to the Vietnamese state. I don't think they are accepted. And so where do they lie? Like literally, where are they? Who cares for them? What sort of memorandum of understanding is ever crafted between the two states? Is there an attempt to bring in the diaspora? I do not know those answers, but for any budding anthropologists or historians or otherwise, it's a fantastic question. It might be hard to get answers because I think it's like a hot potato where not too many people want to answer it. but we should keep asking it. I mean, that's sort of Alex Taibo's and Dot Wen's point, is that, the conversation has excluded these populations, despite the fact there are those who want to ritualize, to bring them back in to, in the very least, to our focus, our commemorative focus.
Thank you again, Dr. Wagner. We'll be in touch and hopefully we'll meet you in person soon. Good night,
Well,
everyone.
if you do it next year, I'll be there. How's that? Okay. Bye, all. Thank you so much.
Thank you.